The silence was the first sign. Not the comfortable, companionable silence that settles over a long married couple. A silence born of shared understanding and the simple peace of presence. No, this was a different creature entirely. This silence was brittle, thin as spun glass, and it vibrated with the weight of unspoken words. It was an active, malevolent thing, and it had taken up residence at our dinner table, sitting between Emily and me like an unwanted guest. We sat across from each other, the remnants of a meal I'd cooked growing cold on our plates. I was eating, or at least going through the motions. She was not. Her fork was a surgical instrument, dissecting a piece of salmon, pushing peas around her plate in slow, meaningless circles. Her eyes, the same warm, hazel eyes I'd fallen in love with a decade ago, darted around the room, landing anywhere but on my face. They studied the new painting on the wall, the flickering candle, the condensation on her water glass. They were the eyes of a fugitive looking for an escape route. I knew something was coming. You don't live with someone for 10 years, learn the unique cadence of their breathing, the subtle shift in their posture when they're troubled, without developing a kind of sixth sense. But the storm I sensed gathering on the horizon was, in my mind, a squall, a temporary downpour we could weather. I was not prepared for the hurricane. I love him. The words, sharp and clear, sliced through the tense quiet. They were not whispered or choked out. They were stated. A fact. A declaration. My hand, which had been lifting a glass of water to my lips, froze mid-air. A single, treacherous tremor ran through my fingers, sending a tiny ripple across the water's surface. I stared at her, my mind refusing to process the sound waves, trying to rearrange them into a sentence I could understand. Asterisk I love ham. I love hims. Asterisk anything but that. What? The word was a puff of air, softer than I intended. The whisper of a man who already knows the answer but asks the question anyway. Her eyes finally met mine, and in their depths, I saw something new, something I hadn't noticed brewing in all the preceding weeks of distraction and distance. It was resolve. A cool, placid, unshakable resolve. There was no flicker of guilt, no shadow of shame. Just a quiet, terrifying determination that sent a sliver of ice sliding down my spine. I love him, she repeated, her voice even stronger this time. And I'm never coming back. The weight of those two sentences was a physical thing. It pressed down on me, crushing the air from my lungs, 1,000 bricks of betrayal and finality. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, to sweep the plates from the table, to demand names and dates and reasons. I wanted to fight for the life we had so carefully constructed, the shared history that was written into the very grain of the wooden table between us. Instead, I did nothing. I sat there, a statue in the wreckage of my own life, staring at the woman I thought I knew. I was trying to reconcile this cold, determined stranger with the Emily who laughed until she cried at my bad jokes, the Emily who held my hand in the dark during scary movies, the Emily I had vowed to love until my last breath. The two images wouldn't merge. They were two different people. All right, I said finally. My voice was a stranger's, calm and measured, a placid lake over a raging inferno. It was too calm. I could feel the unnatural stillness of it myself. She was not expecting that reaction. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows furrowed, and for a split second, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even disappointment, crossed her face. Was she hoping for a scene? For tears? For a fight that would justify her decision? Paint me as the unreasonable one? The flicker was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same unnerving steel. I thought you'd be angry, she admitted, her tone cautious, as if probing a strange animal. Angry. The word was too small, too simple for the cataclysm unfolding inside me. Anger was there. Yes, a molten core simmering deep beneath the surface. But it was tangled with a crushing, suffocating sadness, a sense of loss so profound it was numbing. It was the emotional equivalent of a fatal car crash, a chaotic mess of shattered parts, and I was just a spectator surveying the damage. What would anger solve? I asked. I leaned back in my chair, the simple movement feeling monumental. I crossed my arms over my chest, a subconscious act of self-preservation. My calmness seemed to unnerve her, and in the vast, desolate landscape of my emotions, that small fact provided a tiny, bitter spring of satisfaction. She stood then, pushing her chair back. The scrape of wood on the floor was a raw, ugly sound that echoed in the heavy silence. "I'll be staying with him," she announced. It wasn't a plan. It was a report of a pre-existing condition, a decision made long ago that she was only now deigning to share out of some vestigial sense of obligation. I nodded, a single, sharp movement of my head. I didn't trust myself to speak. If I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure what would emerge. A pathetic plea for her to stay. A vitriolic accusation. Or just a raw, animal sound of pure pain. She hesitated by the door, a silhouette against the fading light. She was waiting for me to say something, anything, to give her a cue, to play my part in the final scene she had written for us. I refused. I gave her nothing but my silence. And then she was gone. The sound of the front door closing was not a slam. It was a soft, final click. The sound of a lock engaging. The sound of a life ending. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. The candle on the table burned down, its flames sputtering and dying, plunging the room into twilight. I stared at the chair she had vacated, at the plate of food she had abandoned. Her words replayed in my head, a broken, merciless record. Asterisk, I love him. I'm never coming back. Asterisk. The life we had built flashed before my eyes, a frantic, disjointed montage. Our wedding day, her face radiant under the veil. The time we got lost hiking in the Rockies and ended up laughing, huddled together under a pine tree in the rain. The quiet nights, reading side by side in bed. The promises, whispered in the dark, of forever. How had we gone from that to this? Or had I gone wrong? A small, insidious voice in the back of my mind whispered that I was not blameless, that I had a part in this. Had I become complacent? Had I taken her for granted? But then another thought, colder and harder, took root and began to grow. This wasn't a slow, mutual drifting apart. This wasn't a tragedy of miscommunication. This was an abandonment. She hadn't just fallen out of love with me. She had actively fallen in love with someone else while she was still my wife, still sleeping in my bed, still sharing my life. She had made a choice. And now, I had to make mine. I rose from the table, my movements stiff, and walked to the liquor cabinet. I poured myself a generous measure of whiskey, the burn of it in my throat a welcome, grounding pain. The storm was brewing inside me, a hurricane of grief and rage. But I refused to let it consume me. I would not beg. I would not chase. And I would certainly not be the pathetic, heartbroken husband waiting by the phone, hoping she'd come crawling back when her perfect fantasy with him inevitably crumbled into dust. If she was gone, then so be it. But I would make sure there was absolutely nothing left for her to return to. The thought settled into my mind, a tiny, hard seed. It was small and quiet, but it was full of a dark, terrible potential. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. One where I would not be the victim. As the house grew darker and the night stretched on, I made a silent vow. I would rise from these ashes. I would be stronger, smarter, and utterly untouchable. Emily had walked out the door, but she hadn't taken everything with her. Not yet. The silence she left behind was an entity. It had weight and texture. It seeped into the floorboards and clung to the curtains. In the first few hours, I sat on the couch and let it wash over me, a drowning man who had given up the fight. I cataloged my own failures, replaying conversations, searching for the moment the first crack appeared in our foundation. But grief is a poor historian, and all I found were more questions. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the blinds, the grief had begun to curdle into something else, something harder. Resolve. She had delivered her verdict with the cold precision of a surgeon. Now, it was my turn to operate. I thought about calling Marcus, my best friend since college. He was my rock, the one person I could be unflinchingly honest with. But the words wouldn't form. To speak her betrayal aloud would be to give it a power over me I couldn't yet bear. Admitting it to him would feel like admitting defeat. Instead, I scrolled through my phone and found a different name, Lisa, a colleague of Emily's, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had always seemed to view my wife with a mixture of professional respect and personal suspicion. I hesitated, then sent a simple, stark text. Asterisk, Emily's gone. I need answers. Can you call me when you're free? Asterisk. While I waited, a new kind of energy began to build within me. It was cold and clear. Emily had assumed, in her breathtaking arrogance, that she could detonate our life and walk away, leaving me to handle the cleanup. She assumed I would be the good, reliable man she had always known, the man who would dutifully manage the fallout while she began her new adventure. She thought she could leave, but keep her safety net, our shared assets, our home, the possibility of a soft landing if her new life imploded. She was wrong. I grabbed a notebook and a pen from the side table, the crisp, blank page a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. It was time for a plan, a strategy. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a hostile takeover of my own life. As the sun climbed higher, I began to write. Phase 1. Secure the perimeter, ****. The first step was financial. Emily saw herself as worldly and sophisticated, but when it came to the mechanics of our life, she was blissfully ignorant. I had always handled the investments, the accounts, the boring but essential architecture of our shared finances. She had a card. She spent. I made sure the numbers worked. Sitting at my laptop, the screen's glow felt harsh in the dim morning light. I logged into our joint bank account. The balance was substantial, the fruit of years of careful saving. It was as much hers as it was mine, legally. Morally? She had forfeited her claim with 2 sentences. My fingers flew across the keyboard. With a series of clinical, emotionless clicks, I initiated a transfer. The bulk of our liquid assets flowed from the shared account into a personal one that she had no access to. I watched the number in the joint account plummet until only a few $100s remained, enough to avoid automatic closure, a token gesture of my contempt. It wasn't about being petty. It was about scorched earth. She had burned the bridge. I was simply salting the ground on my side to ensure nothing could ever grow there again. Next, the credit cards. We had a joint card with a high limit, her go-to for clothes, lunches, and the small luxuries that punctuated her life. A 10-minute phone call was all it took. "Can I ask the reason for the cancellation, sir?" the polite voice on the other end asked. "Irreconcilable differences with my co-signer," I said, my tone flat. "She has an unfortunate habit of financing a new life with my old one." The representative went silent for a beat before clearing her throat. "Understood, sir. The card has been canceled. Phase 2. Reclaim the territory, ****. With the money secured, I turned my attention to the largest asset, the house. This house was our masterpiece, a monument to our shared dream. We had picked the lot, agonized over blueprints, chosen every tile and faucet. Her touch was everywhere, and now it felt like a mausoleum. I called Marcus, not the friend, but the financial advisor. "She's gone," I said, no preamble. A heavy pause. "Gone? Like, for the weekend gone, or, like, I love another man and I'm never coming back gone," I said. The words tasted like ash. "Jesus," he muttered. "Man, I'm so sorry. What do you need?" "The house," I said. "I need it in my name. Sole ownership. I need to start the process today. She can have her memories, but she is not getting half of this property to build a new life with him." Marcus was hesitant. "That's an aggressive move. Are you sure? Once you fire that shot, there's no de-escalation." "There's nothing left to de-escalate," I replied, and hung up. My phone buzzed. It was Lisa. I answered on the first ring. "Oh my God," was the first thing she said. "I was wondering when this would happen. I'm so sorry." "Don't be," I said. "Just tell me. Who is he?" "Jason," she said, the name dripping with disdain. "Jason Thorne. He's a new senior director from the Chicago office. Flashy suits, flashy car, even flashier ego. He's been sniffing around her for months. Everyone saw it. We thought Emily had better taste." Jason Thorne. The name was generic, forgettable. The man who had dismantled my life was a cliché. The thought was both infuriating and, strangely, calming. She hadn't left me for a soulmate. She'd left me for an archetype. "Did you know she was planning to leave?" I asked. "I knew something was up," Lisa admitted. "Late nights that weren't about work. Whispered phone calls. She took a personal day last week. I saw Jason's car in the parking lot when I left, just waiting. I think last night was just her finally pulling the trigger." The information clicked into place, another piece of the ugly mosaic. This wasn't a sudden passion. This was a calculated campaign. My resolve hardened into something akin to granite. By the time I hung up, the sun was fully up. I had severed our financial ties and begun the legal battle for our home. The initial shock had receded, replaced by a cold, purposeful clarity. Emily thought she was starting a new life. She had no idea I was systematically dismantling her old one, brick by brick, ensuring that when she inevitably looked back, she wouldn't see a man waiting for her. She would see nothing at all. The house was a museum of her. Every room was an exhibit dedicated to a life that was now a lie. Her scent lingered on the pillows. Her half-finished novel sat on the nightstand. Her collection of artisanal mugs, each with its own story, stood mocking me from the kitchen shelf. I couldn't heal in a mausoleum. I needed a clean slate. And so, I began the purge. It started in the bedroom, the heart of our shared intimacy. I opened her closet. The scent of her perfume, a floral, woody fragrance I had once loved, billowed out. Her clothes hung in neat, orderly rows. The silk blouse she wore on our anniversary, the cashmere sweater I'd bought her for a Christmas that now felt like a lifetime ago, the simple summer dress she'd worn on our first date. Each garment was a ghost. My first instinct was to hesitate, to feel a pang of sentimental longing. But then I pictured her with Jason Thorne, and the hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cold, cleansing fire. I grabbed the largest trash bags I could find and began. There was a ruthless efficiency to my movements. I didn't fold. I didn't pause. I pulled everything from its hanger and stuffed it into the black plastic bags. Dresses, blouses, trousers, scarves. It was a systematic erasure. From the closet, I moved to the drawers. Lingerie, jewelry, old love letters I had written her. It all went in. I found things I hadn't expected, small pieces of her secret life. A receipt from a high-end restaurant I'd never heard of, dated 2 weeks ago, for a table for two. A small, expensive-looking tube of lipstick in a shade I didn't recognize. These weren't just objects, they were evidence. Each one was another small confirmation that the woman I mourned had been gone long before she walked out the door. The anger that discovery sparked was a useful fuel, powering me through the task. Next, the living room. The photos were the hardest. A gallery of our happiness, lining the mantelpiece and the walls. Us, grinning on a beach in Italy. Us, bundled up and laughing in the snow. Us on our wedding day, young and impossibly hopeful. The man in those photos was a stranger to me now, a naive fool I no longer recognized. With a grim determination, I took each frame down. I removed the photos, stacking the smiling, lying images of us into a neat pile, and tossed the empty frames into a box. Her books, her knickknacks collected from our travels, the absurd number of decorative pillows she insisted were essential to the room's vibe. It all went into bags and boxes. The house began to change around me. With each item I removed, the space felt lighter, the air less suffocating. It was as if I was performing an exorcism, casting out her lingering spirit from the home she had defiled. The bathroom was the final frontier. Her array of lotions, serums, and perfumes lined the counter like a small army. I swept them all into a bag with one clean, satisfying motion, the clatter of glass and plastic an ugly but final sound. By the time I was finished, hours later, the house was unrecognizable. It was stark, bare, and impersonal. It no longer felt like ours. It didn't quite feel like mine yet, either. It was a neutral zone, a blank canvas. And that was exactly what I needed. I loaded a dozen heavy bags into the back of my car. I didn't drive to the local Goodwill. I drove 2 towns over, to a donation center where no one knew me, where there was no chance of some well-meaning acquaintance seeing me unloading the physical remnants of my marriage. As I handed over the bags, the volunteer, a kindly-looking older woman, smiled. "Someone's doing some spring cleaning," she said. "Something like that," I replied. "More like a controlled burn." She looked at me, confused, but I just nodded and walked away. Driving home, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I felt clean. I pulled into the driveway of the house that was, for now, still mine. I walked into the living room and stood in the middle of the empty space. The walls were bare. The shelves were empty. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer the oppressive, heavy silence of grief. It was the clean, quiet silence of potential. This was not an act of revenge. Revenge is a hot emotion, and everything inside me felt cold and precise. This was an act of survival. Emily had amputated herself from my life. I was simply cauterizing the wound to prevent infection. She had walked away, and I was ensuring, with every bag I packed and every photo I took down, that there would be no trace of her left to come back to. I was erasing her, not from my memory. I knew the scars would remain, but from my future. And as I stood there in the quiet, echoing house, I felt the first, fragile flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could build something new, something better, on the ashes of what she had burned down. The decision to sell the house was not an emotional one. It was tactical. The house was the single greatest symbol of our shared life. It was the dream we had built together, nail by nail, choice by choice. To Emily, it was a sanctuary, a testament to the life she believed she deserved. Selling it was not just about liquidating an asset. It was about demolishing the monument. I called a realtor, a man named Henderson who was known for being fast and discreet. "I need to sell," I told him over the phone. "And I need it done yesterday." He came over that afternoon. He walked through the now Spartan rooms, his face a professional poker mask. "It's a beautiful property," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "But it feels sterile. We need to stage it. Make it feel like a home." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. "Do whatever you need to do," I said. "I want the highest possible offer, and I'm willing to close fast." Over the next week, the house was transformed again. A staging company descended, filling the rooms with tasteful, anonymous furniture, art that was pleasant but forgettable, and accessories that screamed aspirational lifestyle. It looked like a page from a catalog. It looked like nothing that had ever belonged to me or to her. This was perfect. The house was no longer a home filled with ghosts. It was a product, packaged for sale. The listing went live on a Friday. The online photos were beautiful, showcasing a sun-drenched, perfect home where a perfect, imaginary family could live a perfect, imaginary life. The showings started immediately. I made myself scarce, staying with Marcus, leaving Henderson to work his magic. Every evening, he'd call with an update. "We had a dozen groups through today. Lots of interest. A couple of second showings scheduled." Each update was another nail in the coffin of my old life. I felt a strange detachment from the process, as if I were watching a movie about someone else. The emotional anchor I'd had to the house was gone. It was just a property now, an entry on a balance sheet. The whispers about Emily and Jason began to find their way to me, as I knew they would. Lisa was my primary source, a reluctant but thorough intelligence officer. "They got an apartment downtown," she told me one night over the phone. "One of those new glass and steel monstrosities. He's been showing off pictures at work, bragging about his fresh start." "Good for him," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Is it?" Lisa's voice was laced with skepticism. "He took a client out for drinks last night. Didn't get home until 3 a.m. The client was a 25-year-old blonde from the marketing department. Emily called the office this morning to check on his schedule. She sounded anxious. So, the cracks were already showing. The shiny new life was already beginning to tarnish. I felt a cold, grim satisfaction, but it was fleeting. Her suffering wasn't my victory. My victory would be my own indifference. A week after the house was listed, Henderson called. "We have an offer. A strong one. All cash. They want to close in 2 weeks." It was from a young family, a doctor and a lawyer with 2 small children. They had fallen in love with the house, the yard, the neighborhood. They wanted to raise their family there. They wanted to build a dream. "Take it," I said without hesitation. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork. I signed documents, initialed pages, my signature a series of sharp, decisive strokes. I was methodically signing away my past. The day of the closing, I had to do one final walkthrough of the empty house. The staging furniture was gone. It was just a shell, echoing with the ghosts of what had been and the promise of what was to come for a new family. I walked through each room, my footsteps loud on the hardwood floors. I stood in the spot where she had told me she was leaving. I stood in the bedroom where we had shared a bed for a decade. I felt nothing. The house was just a house. Its power over me was broken. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and walked out the front door, not looking back. As I drove away, I passed a moving van pulling up to the curb. A young couple got out, their faces bright with excitement. A little girl with pigtails peered out the window. They were about to begin their life here. Mine was beginning somewhere else. Selling the house was the final, definitive act of erasure. Emily had abandoned the life we built. I had sold the evidence that it had ever existed. She had walked away from our future. I had just sold our past to the highest bidder. She had nothing to come back to now, not even a front door to knock on. It was a cold, miserable Tuesday in November when the knock came. Not on the door of the house we had shared. That was a distant memory, a home now filled with the laughter of another family. This was the door of my new apartment, a minimalist space on the 17th floor with a view of the city's unblinking eye. I wasn't expecting anyone. My life had become a quiet, ordered thing. The knock was hesitant, a timid tapping that was almost lost in the sound of the wind whipping against the glass. I opened the door, and the world tilted on its axis. It was Emily, but it was a version of her I had never seen before. The confident, immaculately put-together woman who had walked out of my life was gone. In her place stood a wraith. She was drenched from the rain, her hair plastered to her skull, her expensive coat hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have shed 20 pounds. Her eyes, once so full of fire and resolve, were hollow, haunted things. She looked like a refugee from a war she had started and spectacularly lost. "Hi," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. I said nothing. I just stared, a flood of emotions I thought I had long since buried crashing over me. Anger, pity, a strange, triumphant sorrow. I kept my face a blank mask. "What are you doing here, Emily?" My voice was colder than the November wind. I needed to talk to you." She was shivering, whether from the cold or from fear, I couldn't tell. "Talk." I repeated the word as if it were a foreign object. "I think you said everything that needed to be said." Her lip quivered. "Please," she begged. Just let me in. For 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. She shuffled past me into the living room and stopped short, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. The clean lines, the modern furniture, the lack of any personal history. It was a space that had no room for her. "The house," she began, her voice trailing off. "I sold it," I said flatly. "Months ago." Her head whipped around, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of shock. "You sold it? Without telling me? Did you tell me you were leaving?" I countered, crossing my arms. "You gave up your right to be consulted on my life decisions when you walked out the door." She sank onto the edge of my sofa, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The fight was gone. All that was left was the wreckage. "I made a mistake," she said, the words muffled by her hands as she covered her face. "A terrible, stupid mistake." "Jason?" I asked, the name feeling like a stone in my mouth. She let out a sound that was half sob, half bitter laugh. Jason was a fantasy, a cliché, the charming liar with a beautiful car and an even more beautiful wife he failed to mention. He didn't love me. He loved the idea of me, the conquest. When it got real, when I was no longer a secret, he got bored. He left me 2 weeks ago. I listened, my heart a steady, slow drum in my chest. I felt no joy in her pain. I felt nothing at all. "And now you're here," I said, stating the obvious. "What do you want, Emily? My sympathy? Forgiveness? A place to stay now that your fantasy has imploded?" She flinched at the coldness of my words, but she didn't deny them. "I want to come home," she whispered. I let out a laugh, a sharp, humorless sound that startled her. "Home? There is no home. You burned it down. You think you can just show up on my doorstep, a refugee from the mess you made, and expect me to welcome you back? You think I'm that same man you left?" Tears were streaming down her face now, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. "I was wrong," she sobbed. "I had everything with you. Stability, love, a real life. And I threw it all away for nothing. I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't rebuild a house after it's been turned to ash," I said, my voice hard. "It doesn't undo the months I spent pulling myself out of the hole you threw me in. Your apology isn't for me, Emily. It's for you. It's to make you feel better about the choices you made." I walked to the door and opened it, letting the cold, rainy night into the warm apartment. She looked up, her tear-streaked face a mask of disbelief and despair. "No," she whispered. "Yes," I said, my voice firm, unyielding. "You made your choice. You chose him. You chose that life. And now you have to live with it. I am not your safety net. I am not your second chance. I am the man you abandoned. And that man is done." She stood slowly, her movements stiff, as if every bone in her body ached. She walked past me, pausing in the doorway. For a moment, her eyes searched mine, looking for a flicker of the man she used to know, the man who would have forgiven her anything. He wasn't there. She stepped out into the rain. I closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing the finality of the door that had closed behind her all those months ago. I stood there in the silence. But it wasn't the silence of emptiness anymore. It was the silence of peace. The silence of a future that was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely my own. The storm had passed. The wreckage had been cleared. And I was still standing,